few days ago, I had a dream where I returned to my high school days, but I quickly realized it was a nightmare. It was the day of the final exams, and the Chinese exam was approaching. Faced with the instinctive fear of exams, I was immediately overwhelmed with dread. My subconscious reaction was that I was doomed, as I had forgotten all the classical Chinese poetry in high school. The pressure of that moment nearly suffocated me, and I quickly opened my book to start memorizing whatever I could. The tension of being unprepared before an exam made me anxious, even causing my hands to tremble. But suddenly, in the next moment, I calmed down, stepping out of my 18-year-old mindset and returning to my 26-year-old wisdom. All the stress and fear vanished instantly. From the perspective of my 26-year-old self, that 18-year-old exam was just a piece of paper, worthless once completed. Even if I left all the classical poetry fill-in-the-blank questions unanswered, even if I completely failed this exam, it would not affect the bright and glorious life I would lead thereafter. What seemed like a storm capable of causing chaos at 18 was merely a blue sky with occasional showers to my 26-year-old self. In that moment, I experienced a sense of peace and happiness that I had never felt throughout my entire student life. Then I woke up. Reflecting on the dream, I tried to examine my student self from the perspective of a time traveler. I realized that the root of my anxiety and pain back then almost entirely stemmed from a deeply ingrained but rarely mentioned student mindset of catastrophic thinking. We were repeatedly frightened from a young age with the notion that one exam determines our whole life, that every single point matters. Thus, a single failure could mean the end of our entire future. Since adults couldn't instill hope and certainty about the future, the only thing that could drive and motivate us was fear. This fear included fear of the uncertainty of the future, fear of others surpassing us, fear of not meeting others, expectations. We had to be sufficiently afraid and intimidated by the possibility of failure to endure the long and monotonous student days. Despite the motivation driven by fear causing immense pain and suffocation, we still manage to keep going under pressure, which is the power of fear. But the problem is, once we become accustomed to this catastrophic thinking, we find ourselves lost when we leave the rules of exam-oriented education. This type of thinking magnifies all negative and difficult aspects of life. Small hints become sharp criticisms, little setbacks become reasons for despair, minor hurdles become insurmountable barriers. Problems are amplified to become overwhelmingly difficult, while our sense of initiative shrinks, leaving us feeling unable to cope, doomed to failure, and inescapable. The result is either choosing to escape and remain stagnant, or collapsing emotionally under pressure of anxiety. In psychology, there's a wild horse effect, referring to how some bats in the African savanna survive by sucking the blood of animals, and many swift wild horses die from being bitten by the bats. Initially, people thought they died from the amount of blood the bats sucked. But later, zoologists discovered that the amount of blood sucked was minimal. The real cause of death for the wild horses was their extreme emotional reaction after being bitten. In their frantic effort to shake off the bats, they would run wildly, injuring or even killing themselves in the process. In truth, what really consumes and harms us isn't the problem itself, but our perception of it, including our evaluation of past events, our interpretation of current events, and our anticipation of future events. To stop catastrophic thinking of the past, present, and future, we must focus on solving the real problems that exist now rather than worrying about imagined problems. The specific method involves 3 steps: identification, questioning, and transformation. The first step is clearly identifying catastrophic thinking. When you notice your mind uncontrollably imagining negative outcomes, identify the root cause of your anxiety through the resultant fear. What am I worried about? What real problem exists right now? This step presses pause on limitless catastrophic imagination, detaching from emotions and returning to rational thinking. The second step is evaluating the accuracy of this viewpoint and conclusion, objectively assessing the likelihood of negative outcomes. For example, many people fear flying and potential crashes, but if you objectively look at airplane fatal accident rates, you'll realize that flying is actually much safer than driving. This is how you use objective rational analysis to question your fears, replacing distorted negative views with realistic ones. The third step is transforming future anxiety into present action. After objectively evaluating and analyzing the probability of the worst outcome, ask yourself what you can do now to reduce its likelihood. If it does happen, how should you respond? Write down the outcomes you worry about and plans to address them. In this process, you must force yourself to think of solutions rather than wallowing in fear of the results. Once you start thinking of solutions, you are likely to realize that no matter how bad the outcome, you have the ability to endure and go on. This way, you can dispel most of the fear and anxiety stemming from uncertainty and regain the courage to act. In fact, 99.9% of things in this world aren't enough to destroy a person. Yet we constantly frighten ourselves with habitual catastrophic thinking, scripting horror stories that add pressure and anxiety until we collapse under our own burden. So we must wake up from nightmares quickly, turn on the light, and step out of the dream. As children, we thought forgetting homework was a big deal. In high school, we thought failing an exam was a big deal. At work, we thought screwing up once was a big deal. Looking back now, those hurdles we thought were insurmountable were actually crossed over time without us realizing it. Things often aren't as bad as they seem, and we're not as easily defeated as we think. Our lives actually have a surprisingly high margin for error. So, looking back on that dream, if you could travel back to the moment you were most afraid and helpless, what would you say to your past self? I would say, stand up straight, step forward, and no matter the outcome, it will ultimately